Good morning. This is Caitlin McConnell of Ozarks Alive with Charles Drago of Robertson-Drago Funeral Home in West Plains. This interview is being recorded on March 24th, 2023 in West Plains. Thank you for being here.
No, it's my pleasure.
So kind of starting off, I've read and done a little bit of research on the history of the funeral home and particularly when it was McFarland's.
Mm-hmm.
I've read about Kitty McFarland and that family. Can you kind of talk about, from your perspective, the history and kind of how you guys got to where you are today?
Sure. That's our family started out. The Robertson part was my own aunt and uncle, Paige and Dorothy Robertson. Paige had, I guess, worked for McFarland's as an embalmer, and my Aunt Dorothy had started out with Mrs. McFarland, Kitty, they used to manufacture dresses in their location on East Main Street here in West Plains. And Aunt Dorothy, I don't know if she did much sewing, but she went out on the road selling these dresses to other funeral providers around the countryside, typically by train, and stay out overnight and things like that. And that gradually became, I guess, untenable because she had a daughter that was born in 1920. 2 years before my dad, by the way. I have an aunt that's older than my dad, or had. And finally decided it's time to stay in West Plains all the time. So she started with Mrs. McFarland full-time at the funeral home in some capacity, I'm not certain which. But the explosion, West Plains' famous explosion in 28, obviously changed things completely in the face of the funeral business in West Plains. All of a sudden, Friday, April 13th, 1928, and just before midnight, the explosion called obviously my uncle Paige Robertson, who I incidentally I never met. He died the year I was born. That called them into play, taking care of the deceased at the site of the explosion, and of course they did that for a couple of weeks by the time all of the services were taken care of. In fact, I have two aunts. My Aunt Dorothy and her husband Paige had to take care of unidentified remains, and they knew that two out of those unidentified remains were my own aunts. In other words, Dorothy's sisters, who were in the dance hall at the time of the explosion, and both perished, and were both among the unidentified that were buried in the big plot over there at Oaklawn Cemetery. And I don't know if you visited the big stone out there, and
honestly, I've seen
or maybe know of it.
I've never been out there to see it. I need to do that. Was that something that they talked about after the fact?
Very little.
Yeah.
In fact, I probably got more of that history from Tony Ade and Russ Cochran through his Gazette publication than what my dad or my aunt would have ever talked about. It was very traumatic to our whole family, obviously. And but anyway, long and short of it is that at that point, Mrs. McFarland Kitty had a son, Jack, who was probably 12, 14 years old at that time, a minor. And on the death of Mrs. McFarland, his mother, they set up an estate, a trust for him, run by several of the local business people that knew the McFarlands obviously well, and mostly the bankers in town, and hired my Uncle Paige and Aunt Dorothy Robertson to run McFarland Undertaking Company from its location on East Main Street. And they did that on a just for hire basis, and did that for approximately 6 years. 1934 is when they decided that, you know what, it's time for us to go on our own. And they rented a spot on Court Square to establish their own mortuary.
Okay, and so, and just to clarify too, they had already been in the mortuary business before the explosion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Uncle Paige Robertson, I believe we used to have access to his original embalmer's license in Missouri, and I believe he was licensed from 1920, so several years preceding that. Mrs. McFarland's husband had died in an automobile accident somewhere around 1920, and so she probably needed somebody else there in the business to take care of some of those things.
And so, when they decided to go on their own, was there an option for them to have purchased the business, or did they just decide we want to start and do our own thing?
That is completely unclear to me.
Okay.
I really not even qualified to comment on it. Whichever way it was, they went on their own.
You said
And 1934.
Okay. And so, and you said, where did they move whenever they went out on their own?
The first place that they opened their business was in part of what's now the Opera House on Court Square in West Plains, and operated that until up at that location until buying this location in 1940.
Okay.
This location had been bought by Mrs. McFarland with the intention of using it as her new funeral home location. And this as a residence, was built somewhere between 1900 and 1910 for Judge Green, that was a local popular judge and politician.
I was going to ask about that too, because I remember when I wrote about Mrs. McFarland, it seemed like the craziest, most tragic form of irony that like she'd announced that she bought, this place for a funeral home and then died the next day after it was in the newspaper. And I assumed it was this location that they had been referring to, but wasn't sure. And so that did, I guess obviously the move didn't happen immediately after she died. They were up on the square. I wonder how.
Oh, it was years later, 1940.
Yeah. And I wonder, what made them decide to go ahead and pursue this same property years later.
That's I'm certain that whether they fell out of favor or out of friendship with the executors of Jack McFarland's estate, whichever way it happened, I know that my Aunt Dorothy, through her telling me personally, that she had a great amount of respect for Mrs. McFarland. And in fact, would tell anybody that Jack's mother, Kitty, was a, I believe, quote unquote, lovely person, and that was my Aunt Dorothy's inspiration in the business.
Wow.
A woman in the business, particularly like an undertaking business, pretty much ahead of its time at that point. And so obviously they knew about everybody in town knew about the Kitty purchasing this building. I think I've still got copies of the original deed where it was purchased by Mrs. McFarland, and then later Aunt Dorothy and Uncle Paige bought the building with the express purpose of establishing a mortuary.
Well, and that was something I had to ask about as well, because I saw on a lot of newspaper articles they mentioned lady attendant. Mm-hmm. And I assumed that meant that was something of...
And licensed lady embalmer was in advertising. Put it on the matchbook covers they gave out, stuff like that. But think about the amount of women and their all modesty, let's say, and having a lady on staff. Whether Aunt Dorothy did or did not do that much of the actual preparation mattered little. At least the idea that modesty would be... more enforced with a woman running the show, and I believe that's correct to this day. Mm-hmm. So
I could see that still being I could understand why that would be a factor. Well, and when they moved here, I've read in general funeral traditions about evolving from funerals at home, in that,
or churches, the
yes.
Community churches.
Was that sort of, as you understand it, part of the reason for expanding here? I mean, were they doing funerals in the building on the square, or was this to help them have a bigger place?
I don't believe so, and you're exactly correct that somewhere along that time, embalming at an individual's home where they passed away, waking the person, attending or sitting with the body overnight, things like that, had. Probably somewhat because of laws and regulations about sanitation and things like that. I think they saw that the move was going to be away from doing things at a person's home, and so they needed a place that they could have provide a chapel for services for folks that didn't necessarily want to have funerals at the little community churches and things like that. In 1940, the biggest church in West Plains probably would seat 150 people. This obviously, and this was part of the chapel at the time that they moved here, the room we're sitting in, enough to accommodate a small gathering. And so, but primarily the community churches and churches in town would have been the destination for funerals, so for funeral services.
Well, and for you personally, did you kind of grow up around here too, or how did you decide that you wanted to get into the business?
It's always made me wonder why somebody that didn't grow up in the business would want to be involved with it. But obviously, there certainly are. But from the time I was, I guess, 7 years old, my dad moved our family into the old Langston house across Langston Street from the funeral home. And so I lived over across the street from this funeral home since the time I was 7 years old. I look back and, you get your Social Security record, every year in the mail. And one year I happened to notice that I had earnings on Social Security from back in 1971. When I was 13 years old. And we were going through some stuff years ago, just getting rid of old papers and old bank stubs and stuff. I think I found my actual stub from my first paycheck in 1971. It was like $10 or something like that. Probably helped move flowers on a weekend funeral between school, and also worked on and off during the summers. Things like that.
And just to clarify too, so it was your aunt and uncle and your dad, they were all in the business together.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anybody else, or was it just the three of them?
My cousin Joe, Aunt Dorothy's daughter, Joe Toller,
Okay.
until her death in 1964. She died of cancer. Was a partner in the business. It was really after Joe's death that Dad actually became an owner of the funeral home.
Looking back to the let's say 70s, or your earliest memories of how things work, what was kind of the progression through someone from the time that you heard about a death to the funeral?
It's interesting that you should ask. That really hasn't changed that much. The place of death has probably changed more than anything, but that's actually kind of reverted back to the way it was. Folks passed away at home, attended probably by one of the local doctors, and at the time we had received notification. Aunt Dorothy used to not leave the front doors of the funeral home locked in case somebody just came over physically and knocked on the door to tell us that we needed to go out and get someone that had passed away at their home. When Dad insisted she started locking the door, she made him put a doorbell in so they could still, because Aunt Dorothy lived upstairs at the funeral home. It's a gigantic apartment up there, and that's why we still refer to the place as a funeral home instead of a mortuary, because it was an actual residence for people that lived or worked or owned the funeral home. So, and she lived up there until like 1982 or something like that.
Wow.
So my dad had already died by then, so they just always been family.
Uh-huh.
And I'll probably be the last one. My kids aren't interested in it, but that's the way things go. You know what all the old funeral directors that were owners and managers of funeral homes around here when I was starting out have in common? They're all gone. And none of us are going to get out of that. And I decided a couple years ago it's time for me to retire. So I don't work day to day at the funeral home as I did. And part of the thing is, for my part, I felt a strong feeling that if I was going to be out, I had to be out, that I couldn't show up for one funeral and not another, at the risk of offending someone that, hey, playing favorites, I guess he liked my mom good enough to their mom to come good to do that, and didn't like my mom or something. So that's how I made that policy on that. I was getting ahead of your question. So
No, and I'm glad you mentioned the funeral home verbiage. I never quite thought of it like that before.
That's even in when I was in mortuary school, there was discussion about the nomenclature or verbiage of how things are named, and that's the explanation. As I always understood, a mortuary would simply be a building where the business is conducted, and not necessarily a residence for anyone involved.
Wow. Well, and kind of jumping back to the people, whether they called or came by or whatever. After that,
initially in years past, embalming would typically, and preparation, washing, dressing would take place at the person's home. That shifted pretty quickly to the funeral home, and that's not just us here. That's all around the state. And at that point, we would and we've always gone immediately when we've been notified of a death. Middle of the night, doesn't matter, and brought that person's body back to the funeral home, and did the embalming preparation, washing, as soon as practical after that death. And then have family come in the next day to tell us the arrangements they wanted for funeral, church, chapel, burial at the cemetery only, or whatever they wanted to do. Typically brought clothes into us. We always like to have a person dressed as soon as possible and not lay around for a couple of days waiting for the day before the funeral to dress a person or put them in a casket. And at that time, it was mostly all what we'd call traditional funerals, viewing in a casket, burial at the cemetery, or as folks would refer to, graveyard, the next day after, 2 days, 3 days after death, but in conjunction typically with the funeral.
You know, something that I've heard just from someone, so I'm curious if it's been your experience as well. You know, it was a funeral director who told me that when he started, you know, it was, maybe there was more priority on people for funerals and for the maybe the gathering that it represented. You know, it wasn't something that people tried to plan around other things. And even in some cases, they might have multiple days of visitations. Like, are those things that, you know, you've seen as well in terms of maybe, I don't want to say the shifting importance, but like maybe what funerals mean in people's lives?
I'm not sure it has as much to do with the meaning of the funeral as the fact that folks are possibly more scattered. What used to be, pardon me, I'm a little stopped. Somebody died, the world stopped for that family until that funeral and burial took place, if that was the arrangements that they desired. And nowadays it's come to where we'll have more services scheduled on Saturday by far than any, on the assumption that folks could be off work, kids that live elsewhere could travel in more easily, things like that. So yeah, I'm certain that's a factor. And cremation, of course, especially where the body is not present, and concerns about length of time between death and funeral becomes irrelevant. That's when we're seeing services scheduled out weeks and months ahead of time, and typically on Saturday. So
I was going to ask about that too, where you said that, you know, it was more the norm in the past to have the traditional funeral, burial, all that. I get the sense that cremation has just skyrocketed in prevalence. Is that, you know, what do you think, if that's the case that you guys have seen too, why do you think that is?
In the case for cremation, obviously a number of factors. I guess first and foremost, and you can't discount this, is the cost. Funerals are expensive, cremations aren't cheap. But also, I've always felt like the idea with the cremation is that somehow folks do have the idea that maybe they don't want a funeral, that hey, they're lessening the burden on their family by hey, let's just mail mom to wherever she needs to go in a box instead of having to have a casket and fly her out somewhere. Even for the local concern, it just people have, like I think I've told you, that a lot of folks just don't want folks coming by to see them laying there in a casket, and cremation for the folks that don't want a funeral kind of makes it easier to, maybe in their mind, be a reason that you don't have to have a funeral or things like that. Because we'll probably have most of our cremation deaths that happen nowadays. I think the family typically would tell us that, oh yeah, we're going to have a funeral, and then months and months go by, and finally just decided that, mom really didn't want that, so it doesn't really materialize. Often it does, of course. So,
I know this kind of segues off into more like psychology territory, but I've been curious thinking about this and what role does a funeral or some kind of ceremony quickly after someone dies mean for someone's almost grieving process, and if that's a good thing or if it matters. And also just like how Ozarkers, or maybe people in general, view death today compared to 100 years ago, where you did have people maybe in the community who were involved in preparing a body or things like that. Any thoughts about any of that?
Well, I do, obviously, over the years. And I'll ask you a question in relation to that, if you'll remind me. But as we've gotten away from people just being here, born here, raised here, lived their life here, passed away here. For example, years ago, and I used to have a joke with several of the local business people downtown that they were like perpetual pallbearers. Everybody that passed away, banker Dan Gone, let's say, was a pallbearer more than anybody in town. And you had 6 guys that were friends that were healthy enough to carry a person in their casket. And nowadays, pallbearers are grandsons. So it's family now that's typically doing that obligation, even with a traditional funeral. And the thing I was going to ask you, of course, is that you told me that you're from Marshfield, back in Springfield now. do you have a identifiable cemetery that your people are buried at?
That's a good question. And, for me, I have a couple of different ones where I have a couple of different sections of the family, but it's not a place that would be like the default, you'd have, so probably that's different too.
It obviously has a direct impact on the difference in folks' views on whether, cremation or versus traditional burial. It doesn't mean that they're not going to go and bury cremated remains necessarily at that cemetery and have a marker or identifiable place. But as far as the effect of the funeral, regardless of the means of final disposition, I think that psychologists would always tell you that closure and grief shared is the defining aspect of funeral service. The gathering for this particular purpose and comforting from your friends and from your family. Now, mostly from your friends, because some folks have family they can't stand. and then you got families that are competitive one to the other too. It's like the old deal. I think I read a chapter in a book by an estate lawyer that was titled "First One Back to Mom's House After the Funeral Wins," and so. It's not always just everybody's getting together with shared thoughts and visions about things. There's families have conflict, and sometimes that comes out at a time like this, and sometimes it does not. So,
it's interesting what you said about the pallbearers and the shift from longtime community people to family, and I know it would vary dramatically from instance to instance, but do you think that has any relevance with the shifting way that communities are in the Ozarks, that you may not have the people?
Oh, yeah. Well, why wouldn't it? Let's say, born and raised here in West Plains, the only time I've been out was school, whether it was college or mortuary school, which obviously were away from here. God, I'm running out of friends, and I'm 65. And I don't know that if Pam, my wife, something happened to me right now, and I think about things in those terms sometimes, would Pam have six of my friends that's healthy enough to carry my carcass out to a cemetery? Yeah. So that's I don't have that many grandkids either, so it might be in a hard time there.
Well,
sorry.
I'm like, what's the appropriate response to that? Except I'm sure it would all work out in the end somehow. But
well, it's right now I could probably get current employees to do that, but that's just because we're paying them. So back in the old days, they used to have like paid mourners,
really?
in European cities and things like that.
It's like,
professional.
That the Ozarks, but okay.
Professional mourners. No, that'd be like a European concept from back in the Middle Ages. But it's you might have to pay somebody, or at least have a big dinner afterwards.
Is that still as much a thing too? I mean, like. Okay, so that's the thing that's continued at least around here.
But formality has kind of gone out the window. I've actually seen a couple of those after funeral dinners where people that was there didn't even wait till the family and all the family and the preacher got back to have a blessing before they just dug right in. Those people would have been chastised years ago. There was a procedure on that too.
Well, I'm surprised that the people who felt invited to the dinner didn't go out to the cemetery as well, and they just went straight to wait for the food. But wow.
And sometimes those dinners precede the funeral, of course. Yeah. And in that case, if there's an extra piece of chocolate cake and the undertakers have the service underway and can sneak back to the kitchen, that's been known to happen, but never before the family.
Yeah. Well, kind of, you mentioned your own experience going away to mortuary school and coming back. So when did you go right after graduating from high school, and then? No,
I had a couple of years up at Columbia,
okay.
And but I knew I wasn't going to finish college at that time, and had just gotten married, and I decided that you might need to get serious here. In fact, my dad was pretty instrumental in convincing me that it's time to get serious. So that's just that's the way those things go.
But where did you go to mortuary school at?
The Dallas Institute, Dallas, Texas, was one of those schools that was actually owned by an embalming chemical company.
Oh, really?
Or they're the ones that started it anyway. I had a chemistry professor down there that was a son-in-law to the folks that owned the Dodge Chemical Company. And he held the patent on Prel shampoo. I thought, well, that's kind of unique. So like our anatomy professor, this wasn't just a put-up deal. Our anatomy professor was also the head of the Texas State Anatomical Commission, and was a lecturer at the Baylor School of Dentistry, which was just down the street in Dallas.
Wow.
So it was real instruction, but done in a concentrated course, like what would be the equivalent of 25 hours of instruction weekly. And compacted into a 1 year period of time. Nowadays it's all 2 year.
Okay.
And after that, the national board is what we all took down there. And ones that attended those particular schools had as higher rate of passing the national boards of the National Funeral Directors exams as anybody in the country. So it was quality schools. Pardon me.
After you graduated, did you just come back here and then
directly? In the course of my study in Dallas, my dad had died, and a sister of mine went with me to school at that same time. And our debate was, one of us was going to come back and help Mom, and Mom decided that she, along with a couple of trusted employees, could run the business while we were still gone. But just as soon as we got back here, our duties commenced immediately. And so we had to do the typical apprenticeship for the passing our state embalming boards. The national board exam did not give you an embalmer's license in Missouri, but it did give you a kind of a traveling ticket if you wanted to go to any state in the union, as far as that goes.
Where did you do your apprenticeship at?
Right here with of course, the funeral home has to have an embalmer. Certainly did at that point. The fellow that owned the funeral home in Willow Springs at that time was my apprenticer, and so it basically meant that he just came here and stood and watched me do it, and we had to pay him as if he was doing the embalming. But that's how that works.
Is your sister still involved too here?
Sister passed away 12, 13 years ago,
Okay.
and she was not involved on a day-to-day basis with the funeral home. I bought Mom and the sisters out completely in 1991.
Okay.
So.
Okay. And so it's you, and then now that you're not here day to day, do you just have the staff that they just manage everything?
Very good people.
Okay.
And obviously I try to make it worth their while. And living my whole life here, know a lot of people in town still, particularly the people that would be responsible for planning, arranging, and paying for funerals. And I just live at Gamaliel down here at Lake Norfolk, and people still know how to get a hold of me, and very few complaints over a 2-3 years period of time. That's hundreds and hundreds of funerals and arrangements. I'd know it if things weren't going right.
Well, jumping back for a second to the cremation versus burials, I think I read on your website, was it in '97 that you added a crematorium? And which, this is still something I'm learning more about. Is that more unusual in a rural area to have one, or is that?
In '97, in rural Missouri, it would be. The thing that made that possible, and I'd contemplated it for several years at that point, was that West Plains got natural gas. It was a physical, mechanical concern that really put that idea over the top to have the crematory. When we first did that, of course, I knew that we'd offer the services of the crematory to other funeral directors around us, in which at one time like 10 funeral homes around us were using us as a crematory. And that's gradually shifted down as they've gotten their own crematories and things like that. So
I was going to ask about that, if you had seen like an influx from usage from those places as well as this has grown, but I guess
it's gone the other way around as far as that's concerned. Also, one of the primary burial vault providers, Wilbert, was the one that we were using ourselves to do cremations. That was a drive all the way up to Springfield, and how do you have quality control when you deliver a person to an outfit 100 miles away, and you show back up there the next day, or even wait a few hours for the cremation to take place and the remains to be processed, and you get a box? Where's the accountability in that? I didn't like that angle of it, and so on-site really appealed to me as far as having the crematory.
Do you think you get the sense that with the more the smaller rural funeral homes that have stopped using your services, what made it possible for them to get their own? Are they just less expensive than they used to be, or the
No,
demand
no,
just
no.
gone?
The demand has gotten such that
Okay.
it's more feasible for them to be able to do that.
Okay.
And of course, they all, if they get a crematory, they're going to say, "Hey, you over here at Mountain View, hey, we'll do that for $10 less than Drago over there."
Yeah.
And so that has something to do with it too.
Yeah. You mentioned obviously the future and what that will look like, and something I'm kind of getting the sense too is that you look back maybe 20, 30 years, and there were a lot of funeral homes around the Ozarks that were family owned or locally owned.
Oh,
Maybe
yeah.
that's shifted in recent years. What do you think the future looks like?
Boy, it's hard to say, and like I'll just be one of those old people that was operators when I started out. I'll be gone, so it just. But there'll always be the need. I almost thought that at this point, anytime government money is available for something, there's going to be an industry created around that. That's the same way with the hospice and all of the health care and things like that. I didn't know but what maybe the government money would be available for funerals, even if it was just direct disposition and everybody does what they want with their local preacher and things like that. But ultimately, if you can't get a guy like me to do this as a business and as a living, there's probably be a demand for that to be a public service. And I don't know that that's exactly how it's handled in other places around the world, but I believe that's pretty much a given in certain places. That's part of the healthcare system or things like that. But I do know this: if government made money available for dispositions or funerals, that there would rapidly become a department, local hospital and healthcare centers that would be devoted strictly to doing that and billing whatever, Medicare, Medicaid, things like that.
Well, and something I hadn't really considered until starting this project was the toll that this would take on an individual. Like you talked about with your aunt, somebody could walk in here 24 hours a day, and I'm sure that was similar to your experience. Like, was there even a way to I don't want to say have your own life, but this feels like it would be very emotionally draining to be connected, and maybe that's something people don't feel as inclined to do anymore.
Yeah, I believe that's right. The only thing is that someone not involved with the business wouldn't have any idea about that, the drain or the toll that you refer to. And we changed our business around after I bought the business completely, to where I tried to take off 2 weeks every year. And it used to be I didn't even have an actual day off. I mean, a regular day off. Slip out if we didn't happen to be doing anything, but a funeral home of our size, that's rarely the day that's happening. And so I just obviously I gave up a lot of those days. If our friend's mom's been buried, we would be there for that. Or if it's family or family of the folks that even work here, things like that. It's just always going on. A number of vacations that I've been on. I came back a couple of days early because, the wrong person passed away, and we can't not be here for that. So and nowadays that's different for me since I'm actually retired in that sense.
Did in the past, like especially before cell phones, did you guys have someone here at the phone 24/7?
And also, by the time that the telephone system was able to do like call forwarding and things like that, you could get a couple extra phones at a residence and forward those phones at night. But yes, we used to do that. And one of the little ladies that I offered the upstairs living quarters of the funeral home for would answer the phones here of the evening. And she had to be gone one time though, and one of our friends, a little bit developmentally disabled, out at around Dora, I was taking the phones, which I hadn't done for like even a year or so, and all of a sudden I got a call 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's this fella out at Dora that he gets up early and he just wants to talk. And I said, I won't give his name, but I said, really, you can't be doing that. And he said, well, I call up Mrs. Carter Bobby and talk to her every morning when I get up, and she'll talk with me. And so I asked Mrs. Carter Bobby upstairs about that. She said, oh yeah, bless his heart, he calls every morning, and sometimes I talk to him for an hour. And I thought, oh my God. And so now we use answering service.
Okay.
It's probably not as good, but dang.
Well, speaking of calls and people trying to reach you, something I've been talking with or plan to talk with funeral homes about is ambulance service.
Mhm.
Was that something that you guys were involved with?
Oh
in the
yeah,
past,
definitely.
too?
All the way up until 1974.
Okay.
That's when Missouri decided that professional ambulance service with certain staffing requirements, the equipment requirements came into being, was the time that, and it was my dad's decision, knew it was time to give up the funeral home ambulance service. But he also helped establish the public ambulance service that still exists today. And so that's kind of how that evolved.
Was that something that anybody was sad to see go, or was it kind of like almost?
Not around here. The only thing I missed is that they used to request ambulance to just be on site, like at the stock car races and the drag races in town. So I just do a ride along on that and got to see all the stock car races and rodeos and things like that. But also, as it turns out, had to accompany a few trips. Someone been severely injured in the rodeo. One rodeo in particular is one I remember, and another one the stock car races. That stock car races were a very local thing, right? And I was tasked with sitting and accompanying the person. He was bleeding still, but checked him into the local emergency room here, and they said, "Go right on to Springfield." You could smell the alcohol in that blood. And I was like back there in the back, cooped up while Dad was driving, and it's like, oh my God. Anyway, stuff like that. There's a lot of drinking went on in the pits at the local stock car races. So,
on situations like that, I mean, did you guys have lights and sirens and things at all? And were you kind of allowed to drive faster than normal, or what were the other rules?
At that time, the ambulance service was, pardon the expression, scoop them up and get them to the emergency room. And one time I was doing a ride along with Dad going to Springfield. He was on an emergency run. He had his lights on, but not the siren. And we'd been held up. That was all two-lane road back then. If I remember correctly, it was the road north of Mountain Grove. And I said, "Dad, turn the siren on. They probably pull over." And he said, "They pull over. We're going to get a broken windshield." So that practical concerns. He'd made so many trips. And their main story about the ambulance business was back in the 50s during the polio epidemic. There was one car on the road from this funeral home. Sometimes they'd meet each other on the way back and forth to St. Louis, where they had the capabilities for the iron lungs.
Wow.
So they all hated that, of course, not just because it was taxing on the time and energy, but, well, that's your friend's kids getting sick. And that's the problem with small town undertaking or ambulance driving, either one. You're dealing with your friends.
Yeah. Well, and even on a practical level, I mean, I'm glad you said that. I'd never considered that element of this. But did you guys have several different hearses? Like, was it even a problem for?
Back then, we always had one dedicated hearse, which was the closed back. We always had Cadillacs here, and with the Landau bars and things like that. We also had at least two, what were referred to back then as combination ambulance hearses. They could be used either way. In other words, they had a hook for a cot, but the floor would also turn over to make rollers for putting a casket in if it was doing hearse duty. Okay. But those had open windows in the side and were not used as a hearse unless it just had to double up or something.
Let's see. I'm sure it's. I'm not asking for any sensitive stories, but like mentioning the polio, are there other stories or things that come to mind that you think of as really, I don't know, either key moments or just really unusual moments that have stuck in your mind?
It's hard to say. Yeah. And let's say, I don't want to divulge confidences, but most of these stories could be told without names being involved. Once again, a small town deal. Very likely that anyone here in West Plains will see or hear this interview, but on the chance that they would, we've always tried to, the privacy of the deceased individual and that family has always been a primary concern. But golly, we've seen the conflicts. We've seen some of the humorous stuff too that happens, and even when we make a mistake or things just mess up, that's nobody's fault. Most families have a sense of humor about that, and sometimes it's in the matter of that well, so-and-so, in other words, the guest of honor that was in the casket, would have thought that was funny, kind of like, all right, we're taking the casket down the aisle in their main chapel, and all of a sudden something starts clanking and rattling, and I don't know what's in there, and it's like, I was hoping the casket wasn't falling apart, and we got out to the hearse, and I said, I'm talking to the family, I know everybody heard that, and I didn't know what was going on. And they said, well, we put some golf balls in his pocket. They must have fallen out. And he would have enjoyed you being worried that everything was going to fall apart on that. We had our hearse that we currently use now. Well, it's a couple years old now. It's like 2019. The first time I drove that hearse, one of our guys, our main manager at that time, had driven the hearse to the church. It was a church down there, and I'd never been in this hearse before, but I'm going to drive the hearse to the cemetery, and it's a cemetery that's located miles from the church, up and down hills, and all these cars nowadays have backup cameras, right? And but they always go out when you put it in drive. I noticed when I was halfway down the street, and Thayer Police was escorting us, that the backup camera's still on this thing. And I looked down at the dash, and I wasn't even familiar with the dash at that point, and it said rear door ajar. And I'm like, man, I'm going to have to stop this hearse. I know I closed the hearse door myself, and but what I didn't remember was that we'd also put some flowers in the back of the hearse to accompany us to the cemetery. And then I thought, I'm looking back there, I can see that the door's closed, and typically those hearse doors will have a secondary lock, which fortunately it did, so I didn't stop the procession to do that. It was like the rolling caskets up the aisle after a funeral. Heard a like glass breaking one time, and it's like they'd put a pint of whiskey in Dad's coat pocket, and it fell out and hit the metal bottom of the casket. And it's like, well, family kind of got a kick out of that too. But I was like, oh my God! So stuff like that. I remember those things, and I've never sat down and tried to recall them all. But normally we prefer no excitement, and that's. Okay.
I guess that planning and feeling like you have a handle on every detail is kind of what you guys do. I mean, because whether it's an emotional time for family or whatever, it's important that
you mentioned the combination of the hearses, the ambulance also being able to use for a hearse. We had the pallbearers carrying the casket out to the hearse parked out of our east door, which is where it always sits. And they get out there, and dadgummit, there's a cot in that hearse, and I'm, oh God. Oh, no. They have to take that cot out right in the middle of the family, and the pallbearer's got to sit there and hold it for a minute while we're waiting to do that. That kind of stuff. People typically don't hold that against us, but you don't want it to happen.
Yeah. One thing I didn't ask about that I'd also read on the website was that you guys at least at one point owned the monument company?
Still do.
Oh, still do, okay. So that's a whole nother thing that I guess I could ask lots of questions about, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but is there anything about that area of the business that is particularly like you want to talk about or has changed, anything like that?
It's just like we've had other enterprises too. We own the cemetery up on the highway, Howell Memorial, and but monument companies, I thought I'd have to learn everything about granite, and now it turns out you got to learn about trucks, because those monuments don't do any good if you can't get them out of the shop, and trucks always break down. So it's just stuff like that.
Is it just like, are they just normal trucks that have trouble, or are they so heavy that you have to use special trucks to be able to get them out there?
It has to be like a typical medium frame delivery truck, 450 at least, or a 550 chassis, so that you can mount a hoist big enough to lift a couple thousand pounds up onto them, and obviously a bed stable enough to be able to mount a hoist that can handle that kind of weight. Stuff just breaks down. And we're not accustomed to that here at the funeral home. But if a car has a problem, we just use a different car for a couple of days while it's at the shop, stuff like that. These are special, and there's only one of them, so not much backup there. And that gets kind of tense around Memorial Day when everybody's wanting their marker installed.
And I guess there's probably set times of year when it's easier to install with the temperature outside and things like that with concrete, or I don't
It's
know.
it's the ground condition.
Okay.
And obviously temperature has a lot to do with that. But the drier the better until it gets to be August, and then two guys can't hardly get into the ground with a pick to open the place for the base of that marker to go.
You know, in terms of the design of monuments, has that changed over time? I mean, I've been in some cemeteries where it's almost like a work of art compared to what I would have expected in the past. And is that something that's people feel like they want more ownership of maybe now than they used to?
Obviously, trying to personalization isn't just in the funeral business. And every casket company has personalization options on many of their models of caskets. Obviously, the same way in the monument business: size, shape, color, everything wants to be customized. And photos on monuments nowadays, I think those look good. People like that. And then you got your standard. Here's the stream and mom and dad's house and the deer and the turkey out here. Well, that's hard to argue with. That stuff looks good.
Yeah.
So, but it costs money, and I feel like I'd be a disservice. I'm just trying to sell if I tell people that that's what they got to have, right?
Yeah.
So I avoid that, and I don't do any day-to-day work at the monument company. So I just had enough to do here before I retired.
Where in West Plains is it?
Well, we actually have two.
Oh, okay.
West Plains Monument Company is one of West Plains' oldest businesses. I believe 1889 is on St. Louis Street out at the corner of 160 Highway.
Okay.
Covey Monument Company, my friend Craig and his dad Marshall, is out on South 17 Highway, almost at Glenwood School.
Okay.
So.
Why do you have two different locations in the same town?
We bought one, and then the owner of the other one came up. He was buying. We had also a concrete plant where we made our own burial vaults and things like that. And he started buying bases from us, precast concrete bases, so that you don't have to sit there and wait for the concrete to cure before you can put a big heavy marker on it. Started buying those from us. Talked to my manager up there, and next thing I knew, we were in talks to buy his monument company too.
Is that? I mean, that's amazing. Because you guys can really just do everything. It sounds like.
Well, I don't know about that, but
is that typical for funeral homes to have so many?
No, and particularly not typical for a town our size. But I don't know what's the business model. Vertical integration. It just made sense. And the cemetery up there, and the vault company, the concrete business, were owned by the same fellow and worked for us. And obviously, we were his biggest account. When I found out that he was wanting to sell that, I thought both of them would be available to buy, and it'd probably be good business to do it. Turned out his son wanted to continue in the concrete business, in which pours burial vaults and grave opening and everything like that. And so we just bought the cemetery at that time. That was also in 1997. All 8 or 10 years later, Roger Marshall, who had the son that bought the monument company from his dad, came up, and he was ready to get out of it too. So ended up being pretty logical. But I sold that business a few years ago to a good friend, Chase Brotherton.
Okay.
So.
Last thing, I think, unless there's anything else you want to mention, that's just sort of a random aside, but when I walked in here, it's beautiful.
My Aunt Dorothy.
I was going to ask you.
Is the rose part.
Wow.
No guy like me would probably paint it like this, but she does. Or she did, obviously. And we've changed very little since Aunt Dorothy's time in that regard. Now, carpet like this, that was my decision. The carpet she did have on here was like one of those woven carpets, big rose floral patterns on it. So we had those roses all over the building. First of all, by the time we knew we needed to replace all the carpet, it was prohibitively expensive to buy that wool carpet, and they would have had to custom made that pattern for us. But that just that rose everywhere, and I'm not sure her fascination with that. It makes me wonder if that was Mrs. McFarland's color. But it also happened to match a lot of those. We don't sell much burial clothes anymore, but we used to a lot for ladies. And those gowns, a lot of them were in the rose and the pink color, to go in rose and pink colored caskets and things like that. And I'm guessing that's where she got that.
I didn't realize that those were even still available anymore.
What's that, burial garments?
Yeah.
But we buy very few because folks bring in mom and dad's own clothes.
When did that begin to shift the most?
I'd say in the 80s.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah.
so that far, I didn't learn something else.
As churches, I think, became more casual on, dress code, if you will, at, regular services. I think that probably made things more casual here. And you've seen your mom all your life. She wears what she wears. I don't care if it's sweats or a house dress or whatever. And you come into a funeral home, and here she is. She's been maybe looking bad for a few years, and she's in an outfit that why would she wouldn't have ever bought something like that for herself or worn it. So I think that's and I understand that. So we never tried to sell clothes. It just seemed folks like to do that back in the day.
And I'm sorry, I thought of one more question, and then I will be sure to wrap this up.
Just like at Columbo, it's just one more thing on the way out the door, right?
Do you have competitors in West Plains?
Sure.
Okay. To me, it would seem like it's a competition. But I've gotten the sense in some places that sometimes it's more of a collaboration. Like if there's it's more friendly, I guess.
Yeah.
How do you see, like in a small town especially, that dynamic being?
It's funny that very few small towns like this do you have funeral homes doing 50-50 as far as the total number of calls or deaths, however you want to measure that. And ours is no exception. We do quite a few more calls than our competitor here in town. And to be honest, I'd like to be more like colleagues, but it's just kind of an old saying in the funeral business that you can be friends with the guy in the next town, but not the guy across the street, kind of a deal. But their primary operation is in Thayer, and they do practically all of the funerals there in Thayer. So this is really their secondary operation.
And you guys, this is your only location, right? You don't have other. Okay.
No.
Well, true to my word this time, I don't have any more questions, but is there anything I didn't ask that you want to be sure to mention?
I don't know what it'd be. And like I said, this is part of a visual series, looks like. And I did mention that my Aunt Dorothy had done a recorded interview. I don't think it was visual, but some years ago, obviously before her death. And so I didn't know if that was something that you'd want to throw in there as a comparison. But
if you haven't, the file, I don't know, do you remember who did it?
I don't, but it's supposed to be on record. And if you can look everything up online, it ought to be there somewhere. But that's Dorothy Robertson. And
I'll see if I can find it, and if there's a way, especially, I know that some West Plains students did a series of oral histories years ago, so maybe it was connected with that.
I'm guessing that's right.
And if it was, then probably I would hope it's available for MSU to have access to and stuff. And so I'll do some checking, because I think that would be great.
We've always been friends and neighbors of Missouri State, West Plains, and help them along whenever we can. And I don't think that we've ever gotten crossways, except one time when we bought the old church building down the street from the funeral home and renamed it Langston Street Chapel. There's a city parking lot just down the street, further from it, that we've used freely. And one time, Our Lady, that was the attendant at a visitation or a viewing time down at that chapel, got a parking ticket on her car from the university, whatever kind of kid cop enforcers they have on their university parking lots. Well, I think Dennis was already the interim chancellor at that time, and I got on to him and said, "Dennis, I got a bone to pick with you." And so they had to go back and reinstruct their kid cop enforcers that no, this is not the university's lot to dominate or to control. That's about the only run-in. And I thought we had an appropriate amount of fun with that. Hope the kid didn't get in too much trouble. He just didn't know. But kind of upsetting the lady that was our receptionist down there.
I've got it all got worked out.
Oh, yeah.
But thank you very much. I really enjoyed this and appreciate it. So thank you.